Harold Peterson stood at the gas pump under the blazing Arizona sun, his weathered hands steady as he filled the tank of his old pickup truck. At 78 years old, he had driven this stretch of Route 66 countless times, always alone since Margaret passed 3 years ago. The desert highway had become his meditation, his escape from the empty house that still smelled like her perfume. Today was supposed to be another quiet journey to visit his daughter in Flagstaff, nothing more than miles of asphalt and memories. But the rumble that suddenly filled the air changed everything. Harold looked up to see a pack of motorcycles pulling into the station, at least 15 bikes, their engines growling like mechanical beasts. The riders wore leather vests with patches he couldn't quite make out, their faces hidden behind sunglasses and bandanas. They scattered across the station, some heading for the convenience store, others parking near the pumps. Harold finished filling his tank and tried to move toward the payment terminal, but found his path blocked by 3 bikes parked carelessly behind his truck. He stood there for a moment, calculating his options. The riders seemed young, probably in their 30s or 40s, moving with the swagger of men who owned whatever space they occupied. Harold had seen that walk before, in different contexts, different wars. One of the bikers noticed him standing there and smirked, making no move to clear the way. Harold felt his pulse quicken, not from fear exactly, but from the familiar tension of a situation turning unpredictable. Harold approached the nearest biker, a man with a thick black beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. He kept his voice calm and polite, the way Margaret had always taught him to handle conflicts. He explained that his truck was blocked and asked if they could move their bikes. The bearded man turned slowly, looking Harold up and down with obvious amusement. He called out to his companions, making some comment about the old man being in a hurry. Laughter rippled through the group. Harold felt the attention of the entire pack shifting toward him, like wolves noticing prey at the edge of their territory. He stood his ground, keeping his expression neutral. The bearded man asked where Harold was headed in such a rush, his tone mocking. Harold repeated his request, more firmly this time. Another biker joined them, taller and leaner, with a serpent tattooed up his neck. This one seemed to be evaluating Harold differently, with a kind of predatory curiosity. He suggested that maybe the old man could wait a while, let them finish their business first. Harold glanced around the station. The attendant inside had noticed the situation, but made no move to intervene, probably wise given the numbers. 2 other customers quickly got in their cars and left. Harold realized he was essentially alone with this group, miles from anywhere, with no help coming. The tall biker stepped closer, invading Harold's personal space in a deliberate show of dominance. He asked if there was a problem, if Harold had somewhere important to be. The question hung in the desert air like a threat wrapped in false politeness. Harold took a small step back, not from fear, but to assess the situation with clearer perspective. He counted 15 bikers now, all watching the exchange with varying degrees of interest. Some seemed amused by the confrontation, others appeared indifferent, but a few looked genuinely aggressive. The bearded man lit a cigarette, blowing smoke in Harold's direction. He commented on Harold's truck, calling it a piece of junk that probably couldn't go faster than 50 anyway. More laughter. Harold recognized the game they were playing, the way young men sometimes circled an older target, testing boundaries, establishing dominance in front of their peers. He had seen it in military barracks, in bars overseas, in a dozen different countries during his years of service. The psychology never really changed. The tall biker with the serpent tattoo asked Harold how old he was, making it sound like an accusation rather than a question. Harold answered truthfully, 78. The response triggered another wave of commentary from the group. One biker suggested Harold should probably be in a nursing home, not out on the highway. Another wondered aloud if he even had a valid license. Harold felt the familiar weight in his chest, the sensation of being cornered that he had not experienced in decades. But alongside it came something else, something colder and more calculating. He thought about his phone in his pocket, about the contact list that included numbers most people would never need to call. The bearded man flicked his cigarette butt near Harold's feet, then asked what an old-timer like him was going to do about the situation. Harold remained silent for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities and consequences. He could try to push past them, get in his truck and attempt to maneuver around the bikes, but that would likely escalate things physically. He could go inside and ask the attendant to call the police, but these men would be long gone before any law enforcement arrived in this remote stretch of desert, or he could handle it differently. The tall biker moved even closer, now standing barely a foot away, using his height advantage to loom over Harold. He asked again, more aggressively this time, what the old man planned to do. Harold met his gaze steadily, noticing the dilated pupils, the slight tremor in the hands. Drugs, probably methamphetamine based on the context and demographics. That complicated things. Another biker, heavyset with a shaved head, suggested they should make the old man more uncomfortable, maybe take his wallet to teach him about respect. The bearded man seemed to consider this, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker. Harold slowly reached into his pocket, and immediately 3 bikers tensed, hands moving toward their waistbands. Harold kept his movements deliberate and non-threatening, pulling out only his cell phone. The bearded man laughed, asking who he was going to call, his mommy. Harold didn't respond to the taunt. He scrolled through his contacts with steady fingers, finding the name he needed. The tall biker grabbed for the phone, but Harold pulled it back smoothly, his reflexes still sharp despite his age. He pressed the call button and raised the phone to his ear. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. Harold spoke calmly, identifying himself by a name and number combination that sounded like military protocol. He gave his precise GPS coordinates, which he could see on his truck's dashboard display, and described the situation in clear, unemotional terms. 15 hostile individuals, suspected narcotics influence, situation escalating. The voice on the other end asked one question. Could he maintain position for 12 minutes? Harold confirmed he could. The call ended. The bearded man demanded to know who Harold had called, trying to sound threatening, but with an edge of uncertainty now creeping into his voice. Harold simply put his phone back in his pocket and leaned against his truck, arms crossed, saying nothing. The silence was more unnerving than any threat he could have made. The tall biker with the serpent tattoo looked at the bearded man, some unspoken communication passing between them. One of the other bikers, younger than the rest, asked what was happening, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Harold checked his watch, an old military timepiece that Margaret had given him on their wedding day. 10 minutes and 30 seconds. The bikers began conferring among themselves, their body language changing from aggressive to uncertain. The bearded man tried to regain control of the situation, loudly proclaiming they should just leave, that the old man was not worth their time. But he made no move toward his bike. Harold noticed several of them glancing down the highway in both directions, watching for whatever might be coming. 8 minutes had passed. The sound arrived before the sight, a different kind of rumble, deeper and more organized than the chaotic growl of the bikes surrounding Harold. It came from the east, growing louder with each second. The young biker who had spoken earlier moved to the edge of the gas station property, shading his eyes against the sun to peer down the highway. What he saw made him step back quickly. He called out to the others, his voice tight with tension. A formation of motorcycles appeared on the horizon, riding in tight military precision, 3 columns of bikes moving as one unified force. As they drew closer, Harold could see the details that the aggressive bikers were now seeing too. The riders were older, many with grey beards and weathered faces, their leather vests adorned with patches that told stories of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood. These were combat veterans, members of organizations that Harold had belonged to for 50 years, men who had answered the call when one of their own needed assistance. The formation pulled into the gas station with choreographed precision, engines cutting off in synchronized silence. More than 30 riders dismounted, standing in loose formation around the perimeter. The contrast between the two groups was immediately obvious. Where the younger bikers had been chaotic and aggressive, these veterans stood with disciplined calm, hands visible, postures relaxed but ready. Their patches identified them: Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, combat tours in Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. The lead rider, a man in his mid-60s with steel-grey hair and eyes like flint, walked directly to Harold. They shook hands, and the older rider asked if Harold was all right. Harold confirmed he was fine, thanking the man he addressed as Sergeant Major. The veteran nodded, then turned his attention to the younger bikers who now looked significantly less confident. The bearded man, who had been the primary antagonist, tried to maintain his swagger, claiming there was no problem, just a misunderstanding. The sergeant major listened without expression, then asked Harold directly if these men had threatened him or prevented him from leaving. Harold recounted the situation accurately, without embellishment or emotion, just the facts as they had occurred. The tall biker with the serpent tattoo tried to interrupt, claiming the old man was exaggerating, but one of the veterans, a massive man with a prosthetic leg visible below his jeans, suggested he might want to stay quiet. The sergeant major explained something to the younger bikers, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. He told them about the network they had just encountered, organizations of combat veterans who looked after their own, who could mobilize anywhere in the country within hours, who had brothers in law enforcement, in government, in every corner of society. He explained that Harold was not just some random old man they could intimidate at a gas station. Harold was a decorated veteran of Vietnam, recipient of medals these young men had probably never heard of, a man who had served his country with honor while most of their parents were still in diapers. The bearded man's face had gone pale, the swagger completely evaporated. The sergeant major continued, noting the patches on their vests, identifying their club affiliation. The sergeant major mentioned that he recognized their club colors, knew the organization operated primarily out of New Mexico, and had connections to narcotics distribution. He casually mentioned that several of his brothers were with state and federal law enforcement agencies, and that this gas station almost certainly had surveillance cameras recording everything that had transpired. He suggested that the young bikers might want to consider their next actions very carefully. The heavy-set biker who had suggested taking Harold's wallet was now looking at the ground, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The tall biker tried one last attempt at defiance, asking what gave these old men the right to interfere. A female veteran stepped forward from the formation, her arms covered in burn scars, patches identifying her as Air Force combat medic. She asked the tall biker how old he thought she was. He did not answer. She told him she was 53, had spent 2 tours in Iraq pulling burned soldiers from destroyed vehicles, had lost 3 fingers and most of the hearing in her left ear to an IED, and had exactly 0 patience for cowards who threatened elderly civilians. The word coward hung in the air like a slap. Several of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably. One of them, wearing newer leather and fewer patches than the others, walked to his bike and started the engine. He pulled away without looking back, breaking the formation. It was like a dam cracking. 2 more followed, then another 3. The bearded man looked around at his dwindling group, realizing he had lost control of the situation entirely. The sergeant major took a step closer to the remaining bikers, his voice dropping to a quieter register that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have. He explained that they had a choice now. They could apologize to Harold, move their bikes and leave peacefully, or this situation could become a matter for law enforcement with multiple witnesses, video evidence, and charges ranging from harassment to attempted robbery to conspiracy. He pulled out his own phone, showing them that he had already recorded video of the confrontation, time-stamped and uploaded to cloud storage. The bearded man looked at the tall biker, some internal debate playing out between them. Finally, the bearded man turned to Harold and mumbled something that might have been an apology. Harold remained impassive, neither accepting nor rejecting the words. The tall biker took longer to break, his jaw clenched, pride warring with survival instinct. Eventually, he too muttered a grudging apology. The sergeant major nodded toward their motorcycles blocking Harold's truck. Within seconds, the bikes were moved, engines starting with less aggressive rumble now, sounding almost subdued. The remaining young bikers mounted up, 8 of them now instead of 15. The bearded man gave one last look at Harold, something between resentment and what might have been respect, then kick-started his bike. They pulled out of the station in a loose, disorganized departure, nothing like the unified formation of the veterans who had come to Harold's aid. The sergeant major watched them disappear down the highway, then turned back to Harold with a slight smile. Harold thanked the sergeant major and the assembled veterans, shaking hands with several of them. They exchanged brief stories, the shorthand communication of people who had shared similar experiences in different decades. One veteran had served in Harold's old unit just 20 years later. Another had a father who had been at Khe Sanh during the same siege where Harold earned his Purple Heart. The female medic with the burn scars asked if Harold was headed anywhere important. He mentioned visiting his daughter in Flagstaff, his weekly trip since Margaret died. Several of the veterans nodded with understanding, recognizing the ritual of staying connected to family, of fighting against the isolation that claimed so many aging veterans. The sergeant major asked if Harold was involved in any veteran organizations locally. Harold admitted he had let his memberships lapse after Margaret's death, finding it hard to attend meetings alone. The older veteran pulled out a card, writing a phone number on the back. He told Harold that isolation was the enemy, that the brotherhood did not end just because you got old or lost your spouse. He mentioned chapters in Flagstaff, active groups that would welcome Harold, men and women who understood what it meant to serve and to grieve. Harold took the card, feeling something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tightness that had been there for 3 years. One of the younger veterans, probably in his 40s, asked Harold about his truck, noticing military stickers on the back window. They talked about mechanics and maintenance, the practical conversation a relief after the tension of the confrontation. The veterans began mounting their bikes again, their mission accomplished. The sergeant major reminded Harold that the call system worked both ways, that if Harold ever needed anything, a phone call would bring help anywhere in the country. He also mentioned that if Harold ever saw other veterans in trouble, he should not hesitate to activate the network. It was a responsibility that came with the privilege of membership, the unspoken contract that bound those who had served. Harold understood this deeply, feeling slightly guilty that he had let his connections atrophy in his grief. Several veterans paused to exchange contact information with Harold, phone numbers and email addresses scrawled on the backs of business cards and gas receipts. The female medic gave him information about a support group for widowed veterans, mentioning that her husband had died 6 years ago and the group had saved her life. Harold thanked her, his voice rough with emotion he was not quite ready to express. The engines started again, that deep, synchronized rumble that spoke of discipline and unity. The formation re-established itself, bikes falling into position with military precision. The sergeant major gave Harold a final salute, which Harold returned with the automatic reflex of decades-old training. Then they were gone, pulling out onto the highway in perfect columns, disappearing into the shimmering heat of the desert afternoon. Harold stood alone again at the gas station, but the solitude felt different now, less like isolation and more like temporary pause between connections. Harold finished paying for his gas inside the station, where the attendant asked if everything was okay. Harold assured him it was, noting the relief on the young man's face. The attendant mentioned he had been about to call the police when the other bikers arrived, not knowing who they were or what would happen. Harold explained briefly about veteran organizations, about networks of mutual support that most civilians never knew existed. The attendant, who looked barely 20, listened with something like awe, saying his grandfather had been in the military, but never talked about it. Harold suggested the young man might want to ask more questions, learn those stories before they were lost forever. He knew too many veterans who had taken their experiences to the grave, leaving families with nothing but silence and mystery. Harold got back in his truck, placing the cards he had received in his sun visor next to the old photo of Margaret he kept there. He started the engine, a quieter sound than the motorcycles, but reliable, steady. As he pulled back onto Route 66, heading north toward Flagstaff, Harold felt different than he had an hour ago. The encounter had stripped away some of the protective numbness he had wrapped around himself since Margaret's death. It reminded him that he was still part of something larger, still connected to a community that valued honor and mutual protection. The desert stretched out before him, endless and beautiful under the afternoon sun, and for the first time in months, Harold felt ready to rejoin the world. 3 weeks later, Harold attended his first veteran meeting in Flagstaff, walking into a VFW hall filled with familiar strangers. The sergeant major had called ahead, and Harold was welcomed like returning family rather than a new member. He found himself surrounded by men and women of all ages, sharing stories and silence with equal comfort, understanding without needing to explain the weight that veterans carried. Harold volunteered to help with a program supporting homeless veterans, finding purpose in service again. He joined a riding group, borrowing his son-in-law's motorcycle for weekend trips, feeling the wind and freedom that had drawn so many veterans to two wheels. His daughter noticed the change in him immediately, the way he stood straighter, spoke with more energy, engaged with life instead of simply enduring it. Harold thought about that day at the gas station often, about how close he had come to serious trouble and how quickly help had arrived when he called. But more than the rescue itself, he thought about what it represented, the unbreakable bonds forged through shared sacrifice, the commitment to never leave a brother or sister behind, regardless of age or circumstance. He had made new friends, attended memorials and celebrations, and slowly rebuilt the connections he had let atrophy in grief. Margaret would have been proud, he thought, of him finding his way back to the community that had defined so much of his life. And somewhere on a highway in Arizona, other veterans were riding, maintaining their network, ready to respond when one of their own needed help. The brotherhood endured.